What's up, everyone? True Techno Gamer back at it. I know it's been a while, crazy few months for me, but I'm back. I have a bunch of content that I want to put out there. Please like, subscribe to the channel. Keep giving me the support. Let me know you're still watching. Let me know you're still interested. Now, for this video, this actually was inspired by one of my work colleagues who just happened to ask me the question. They have a PS5 Pro and they were just saying like, hey, yo, I'm just not seeing that much of a difference. I'm not seeing it, man. Do you see a difference? And my immediate response to that was, well, honestly, in the context of graphics in general in 2025, the answer is no, because I fundamentally don't feel that anything really shows a big difference nowadays. We're just past that point. We're definitely in diminishing returns. We're at pixel level, details and effects and algorithms. So no, I don't think, ultra to medium on PC is really that large. And I don't think, console to PC is really that large. When you really think about it, we're just living and constantly playing the game. Can you spot the differences, right? That's what Digital Foundry is basing their whole career on, right? And a bunch of other sites. Can you spot the differences? Let's pause, zoom in, and analyze to try to spot the most minute differences. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, not really a big difference. And the same is true with the PS5 Pro and the PS5. But it really got me thinking. I mean, there is value to the PS5 Pro. And of course, it depends on the games. And it just got me thinking, like, so what is that value? Where is it? How do you identify it? What are the best use cases for the PS5 Pro? How should developers really approach optimizing the PS5 Pro? And it got me really like, you know what? I got it. I laid it out and I'm going to present that to you guys here. So hopefully you're ready. You're buckled up because we're going to do a bit of a deep dive and just my interpretation and really me breaking it down to what are the best use cases? Where does PS5 Pro really shine? And how do you find those scenarios? So stay tuned. Let's get into it. So PS5 Pro has been out now since November of last year. The reception has been pretty mixed, right? There's definitely some good examples, some bad examples, and I'm going to show you some of both sides, right? I'm going to show you some of the best cases and some of the worst cases, and then what to look out for, right? Before I get into the specifics of the examples, we got to start back to the beginning. Let's make sure that we all understand what the PS5 Pro was about, according to Sony and according to system architect Mark Cerny himself. So to do that, let's just look at, the big three, as Sony calls it. Now, the PS5 Pro essentially, in a nutshell, are these three things, okay? The larger GPU, right, which mathematically is actually about 67% larger based on the number of compute units and the amount of compute power. Sony says based on, the summation of everything, including memory bandwidth and stuff like that, the actual rendering performance is roughly 45% faster than a base PS5. But the GPU itself is almost 70% larger. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. That's just raw power, right? On top of that, we have what Sony calls advanced ray tracing. It means that the PS5 Pro can process and execute ray trace calculations much faster than the base PS5. The numbers that Sony put out there was about 2 to up to 4 times faster, or 2 to 4 times more calculation for ray tracing, right, in the PS5 Pro. Again, I can attest that I have heard directly from developers' mouths that they are seeing real world performance of 3 times the actual, ray trace performance, or ray trace calculation performance compared to a base PS5. Like 3 times. I've heard that number from several devs. So it is in the ballpark of 2 to 4x, which is not insignificant at all, right? That's actually a pretty good bump. All right, but let's keep that in mind. And then finally, the AI-driven upscaling. This is the machine learning powered reconstruction technology, super resolution technology. So this is the powerful tool to help developers get to a high quality 4K image without putting so much of a burden on the graphics card. So let's understand these things in context, okay? Now, Sony says if a developer were to use all three of these things, they can achieve roughly 2 times the performance, or at least 2 times the performance of a base PS5. When you put these things together, the GPU alone isn't 2 times larger. I just said that. It's about 70% larger, right? Advanced ray tracing, not every game uses ray tracing. And ray tracing is just part of the overall workload in a typical game, even if ray tracing is used. So just because it's 3 times more ray tracing calculation doesn't mean you're going to get 3 times the performance, right? That's not how that works. And then the AI-driven upscaler. So how does that work? Let's remind ourselves. This is similar to DLSS by NVIDIA and FSR from AMD. Same concept, okay? The idea is these are sophisticated, powerful ways to take a lower resolution image and upscale it or blow it up to a larger output image, okay? And you can take like a 1080p frame, the GPU is doing that, and this upscaler will ultimately give you a 4K output based on training data for how that particular game should look at 4K resolution. In other words, the AI can fill in the pixels, the missing pixels from the 1080p frame. That's how that works. And what's the benefit of that? You can get more performance, right? It would take 4 times, right, the performance to get a 4K output if the GPU was doing that natively. So that's what this is about. That's what the PSSR can do. And now you can see how you can get a lot more performance, right? If you can take, and think about it in this context. If you had to take, let's say, an FSR quality mode, which is 1440p input resolution in order to get to 4K and have it look reasonable, you might be able to reduce the resolution for PSSR because PSSR is smarter and can do a much better job of filling in the pixels and giving you a sharper output. Okay, that's the idea. So at launch on the PS5 Pro, there was a number of games that actually had lower resolution on the PS5 Pro, and people were like, "Oh my gosh, how is that happening? What is going on? How are we getting this lower resolution?" That's why. Because that's the whole point. Because it's just using this really smart, sophisticated AI upscaler, it doesn't need to have as much input data. In other words, it doesn't need to have as much of a internal frame resolution. Right? It doesn't need to be as high as you may need on the base PS5 using less sophisticated upscaling technologies. So you can reduce the resolution, freeing up even more of that already more powerful GPU. And when you kind of do those things in conjunction, that's how you can take that 70% larger GPU or 45% more rendering performance and now get you to something that is closer to 2x or even more in many cases, right? So PSSR and this AI-driven upscaler is a key thing in terms of the PS5 Pro story. Now, the idea is that putting these 3 things together, you can get meaningful boosts to your games, and in my opinion, much larger boosts than what you can get previously on the PS4 Pro. Is there fundamentally a huge difference between PS5 Pro and PS5? I would say no. If you're playing the games in front of you, just looking at it with your eyes, you're not going to see a huge difference most of the time, okay? Now, there's ways to break up the advantages of the PS5 Pro. To me, the biggest differences that you're going to see in terms of visuals, in terms of graphics, where you can look at a still frame side by side and look at an A versus B comparison between the base PS5 and the PS5 Pro and see a meaningful difference. There is a time that can happen, and that is when it involves ray tracing. There are a number of games on the PS5 Pro that have been updated to either add ray tracing effects that didn't exist before on the base PS5 or to expand upon the ray tracing that was on the base PS5. And when you see those examples, you can look at a still frame and see a meaningful difference. Now let's look at what some of those examples can actually look like. Now, one of the best examples of this, of course, is Alan Wake 2. For Alan Wake 2, and this is one of the games that to me, ray tracing actually makes a meaningful impact. As you can see in some of these shots I'm going to show, okay? So, as you can see, the quality mode on PS5 did not have any kind of ray tracing, so you can see on the glass here, it just doesn't look, very realistic. And then now on the right with the Pro, you can actually see the whole city environment reflected in the mirror, in the glass here, right? Again, just looking at this side to side, anyone with eyes can see that's an actual difference, right? And when you're playing the game, not that you play the game running both PS5 and PS5 Pro side by side, right? That's the problem. It's not how we actually operate. But if you were to see this running side by side, it would, clearly be a difference, right? And here's another meaningful example. I played through Alan Wake 2 on the base PS5 in its quality 30 FPS mode, because the 60 FPS mode, the image quality to me was just too poor on a big 4K screen like I have. It just took me out of the experience. So I wanted to get the higher resolution, but one of the most glaring problems with the quality mode was what you see here. There's a lot of places where there are mirrors in the game and where there would be meaningful reflections where there is just nothing. It's just like this blob, and it looks really bad in motion when you're playing it. It's really, really like aliased and pixelated, and it just looked bad. It was like, it's like, what is that? So, not that this is the highest quality reflection by any means, but it is, a generally representative reflection of this character. It is dynamic in the motion. As you move, you'll see the reflection move through the mirror. And it's one of those things that really, in this particular case, adds a lot to the experience. But again, anyone with eyes can see this is a meaningful difference. If I pointed out to you that the one on the right is running at higher resolution, would you believe me? Right? Look at the text on the wall. Could you tell? Right? Probably not. But you can see the reflection. And here's another example. So ray tracing, again, is not just about reflections and mirror reflections. This is about specular highlights and kind of getting a sheen, right? So it can affect the material property, which is why it takes work. It takes artist work as well. So here, there's a specular layer added on top of this wood where you get this kind of sheen effect, which again, you're getting this diffuse reflection from the light coming from the outside, which again, you don't see any of it here. So it changes the whole, look and dynamic of the material, as you can see here. All right, another great example of a clear AB due to ray tracing is in F1, Formula One 24. So this was a title at launch of the PS5 Pro that was updated. And as you can see in gameplay, the base PS5 doesn't have any ray tracing effects. And on the PS5 Pro, in gameplay, while still maintaining that 60 FPS, they've added ray trace GI, RTGI, RT reflections, and I believe RTAO. I think it's RTAO layer. So they pretty much match what you can get maxed out on the PC, except for RT shadows. Which would have a minimal effect, honestly, on the game visually while you're racing, especially. So you can see here again, look at the right, look at the tiles. Again, it's a whole different look to the tile. You can clearly see reflections on there. The colors are different there. You can even see the GI in effect here. You could tell the roof of this looks a little bit better shaded, a little bit more grounded, whereas it looks kind of overly brightened on the base PS5. That's RTGI in effect, and the RT reflections on the right there. While you're racing, again, going over 100 miles per hour to almost 200 miles per hour, are you going to notice a lot of this stuff? If you're looking for it, maybe you might glance and say, yay. But while you're playing the game, no, right? Not really. Honestly, most people are not going to notice this stuff. But again, on a still, if you want to just know what the PS5 Pro is doing, this is another good example of that. Here's another example. There actually is a lot of differences here, but again, they're all still pretty subtle. Everything from the building back here, you can see there's a very different look in terms of the reflection. So the one on the right is using RT reflection. It looks much cleaner, much more discernible, right? This doesn't look like anything. So you can see that. You can also see, just look at the, I guess there's kind of like a glass plane along the sides here. And if you look, they look very different, right? Again, you also get a little bit more of that grounded shading because of the RTGI. Look at the area here. The RTAO is coming into effect. That's the ambient occlusion. Things look a little bit better shaded here, more grounded. You can't even see the text and make out of the text. The color looks different again, right, because of how light is being treated in here in a non-ray trace scenario versus the ray trace scenario. This actually looks red. You can see the text. So it's a lot of stuff going on like that. And even the car in front, the colors are different. How you can make out the colors are different. All of this is, again, the finer details of what ray tracing can bring to the scene. Again, reflections on the sides here as well. Another example that doesn't get a lot of discussion and hasn't been talked about a whole lot, but I think is interesting is Dead Rising, right? So there was a Dead Rising remaster that released around the PS5 Pro launch. And this was the initial ad that showed the difference. And again, it's higher resolution and stuff like that. But this is the key difference here, right? In a game like this, if you haven't played Dead Rising, it takes place in a mall. There's a bunch of glass and storefronts and marble materials around. There's a ton of reflections, right? So look at the left. I mean, as you're walking around, you pass by these storefronts, there, it looks kind of weird, right? It looks kind of blurry. It doesn't look very realistic. And if you were actually seeing this in motion, you've seen this live in the game, it doesn't look all that great. And it doesn't move very, very realistically. So here, that's a realistic reflection. You actually can get some reflection. You can see through the glass a lot better. And then down here, you can see that lake. There are objects that visible here in the reflection that's just not visible there, right? So this is just another example. I just pointed this out to say, this is not a great picture. You probably can't see it great on the video here, but check out that game if you haven't. On the Pro, it does look, meaningfully different with the ray trace reflections in it. All right, another game that we're going to talk a lot more about actually, because this is a great example of a Pro integration, but Assassin's Creed Shadows, a pretty recent example, and this was talked about as having the largest difference, Pro difference, we've seen. And that's what you're looking at here. It looks dramatically different, right? And what you're seeing here is the performance mode. What's happening is that the performance mode on a Pro is able to retain the full ray trace GI throughout the entire world. Whereas on the base PS5, there's no ray trace GI, and it has to use the fallback of pre-baked global illumination. Which, that was a common thing back in the PS4 generation, and it looked great. But as we can see, it's not ray trace GI, right? So Assassin's Creed Shadows actually has a really sophisticated and very well done, very well implemented, I think, ray trace GI solution. And the PS5 Pro is able to run that in the 60 Hz performance mode. So that's what we're seeing, performance mode versus performance mode. You do see a visual that looks like that on the base PS5 if you run it in the quality mode or fidelity mode, or even the balance mode, I believe. But the performance mode, doing that at 60 was a bit too much for the base PS5. But the Pro, with again the advanced ray trace hardware plus the larger GPU itself, is able to do that. So that's a pretty transformative AB, and it's again due to ray tracing. All right, so you saw the difference that ray tracing can make in some key games. Okay, at least looking at still comparisons. Okay, now even without ray tracing, there are a couple of games that do benefit from the PSSR, the Super Resolution AI upscaler, just making a meaningful difference. And just the higher resolution sometimes making a meaningful difference. One of the classic examples for the PS5 Pro, of course, is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Here you can see it. This is a scenario where on the left, there is the PS5 performance mode, which looked noticeably blurry. It was a pretty big disappointment at the time, even when that game came out on the base PS5. People wanted to play it at 60 Hz, but it just looked too blurry and lacking detail. The graphics mode, as you see, looks nice and sharp, but it runs at 30 frames per second. So what the PS5 Pro is bringing is a single mode that runs at 60, like performance mode, but clearly, as you even in this video, I'm pretty sure you can see, it looks dramatically clearer, right, and sharper than what the base PS5 version. And that really is that AI upscaler in action and one of the best case scenarios for it, okay? In fact, if you really look at it compared to the graphics mode, which technically runs at a higher resolution on the base PS5, it looks sharper than even that. I don't know if you can see that level of difference. I can, looking at it right now on my computer monitor. If you play this game looking at it on a large TV screen, you absolutely will still see that. But look at the area around here by the stairs. Look at that. It just looks sharper, right? It just, you can resolve more detail. It doesn't look quite as blurry there. And even over here by these plants here, it looks sharper, noticeably sharper. Even the character model, Aerith, she looks a bit sharper around here, around her face and hair and stuff. So this is the promise of PS5 Pro, right? Quality mode or graphics mode at 60 FPS or beyond, right? And PSSR is able to, again, fill in those gaps in such a great way that it even eclipses the higher resolution of the graphics mode on the base. So looking at this close-up model of one of the characters, again, the clear winner here is the PS5 Pro mode, right? I mean, his facial details, I don't know how that's coming through in the video, but even looking at, you can make out the hair strands along his nose here. You know, this is PSSR. The area around right here, this looks still really blurry here in the graphics mode, and it looks really clear here in the PS5 Pro mode. So again, like I said earlier, right, this is pixel level zoomed in still image, comparisons where we can see. Now, again, there are differences though, but they are relatively small. Put it together, it makes a big difference in the whole scene for sure. But still, this is where we're at with graphics today, right? This is what we got to do, right, to really make out these differences. All right, so now beyond that, there's another key advantage of the PS5 Pro. Like I said, I admit it. A lot of the ray trace differences, the IQ differences may not be very noticeable to most people, to be quite honest, right? Looking at it on your typical monitor or screen, the distance you sit from it, you're not going to notice the differences that when we're already talking about such high resolution and stuff like that. But playing the game, you will notice a difference in smoothness and feel for times when we can get higher frame rates. Okay, and to me, that's probably the biggest selling point and the biggest differentiator for PS5 Pro. There's been a number of games that have had exclusively for the Pro modes where you can unlock the frame rate and push even beyond 60 while still having the quality of, as you've seen, like basically matching the quality mode for the base PS5 in many cases, right? Or just having everything maxed out where you were limited to 60 on the base and now being able to push closer to 120 on the Pro. That combined with things like the higher IQ for PSSR, the higher frame rate, you get better smoothness, better responsiveness. That's where the magic comes together. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples. I think that are some of the best examples of that coming together. So one of those is Resident Evil 4 Remake. If you look at Resident Evil 4 Remake, honestly, it doesn't look very different just in terms of a pure visual perspective, right? Even doing those like screenshot comparisons, you're not going to notice much of a difference, okay? But exclusive to the PS5 Pro version is a high frame rate mode that, again, it basically allows you to unlock the frame rate and it targets 120 FPS, which of course you need a compatible TV for, 120 Hz compatible TV. And if you have such a TV, which is kind of what they're showing here, you can see what you can get. There's two modes in the game. There's a resolution mode and there's a frame rate mode. And you can activate this PS5 Pro high frame rate mode on top of both of them. Essentially what you get is in the frame rate mode on the left, you see that the performance is generally above 100 frames per second. It looks pretty much close to the resolution mode. It runs at a slightly lower input resolution and uses PSSR, which theoretically, again, shouldn't even be noticeable that it's lower resolution. And it pushes closer to 120. You see it's not quite hitting 120, but it's getting pretty close, all right? And that's with ray tracing turned off. On the right is basically Resident Evil 4 maxed out. Ray tracing is on. All the ray tracing modes and effects are on. It's in the high resolution mode as well, so it's pushing the higher resolution. It's still using PSSR to get you to a 4K output, but it has a higher, input resolution, so it does look a little bit sharper. Ray tracing is on. The hair technology, the hair strand effect is on. Everything is on and maxed out, and you are still getting, as you can see, well above 60 FPS, typically in the 70s or even 80s, which again, on the base PS5, if you were to turn everything on, if you turned ray tracing on at the high resolution with the hair strands and all of that good stuff, you were going to see drops into the low 50s and even upper 40s at times. So now you see we were at 70 to 80 FPS. That's a PS5 Pro difference. That, again, wouldn't show up in a still side by side, but when you're playing them and you turn everything up and unlock that frame rate, it's going to feel worlds better. All right, another excellent case of the PS5 Pro is Stellar Blade, which is an awesome game, by the way. If you haven't played it, definitely play it. Now, the PS5 Pro brings two exclusive modes. One is, let me pause this here. One is what they call Pro Max mode. Now, this is interesting. This mode runs at native 4K. Okay, native 4K, which the base PS5 has a native 4K mode as well. It's quality mode. So the quality mode, I think, or fidelity mode, whatever they call it, on the base PS5 runs at native 4K, but is limited to only 30 frames per second. Okay. On the Pro Max mode, it runs at that same native 4K, but now uses the bigger GPU primarily to get to something closer to 50 FPS on average, right? It targets 60, but it kind of mostly runs at 50. Well, that's almost twice the resolution, right? I'm sorry, that's almost twice the frame rate, right? For a GPU that's only supposedly 45%, faster in terms of rendering, you're getting almost twice the performance there at native 4K, right? So that is pretty cool in and of itself. But what's interesting about this game is that's native 4K. It doesn't use PSSR, right? It doesn't use the AI upscaler. It has another mode that they just call the PS5 Pro mode, as you see on the right here. And that mode actually does use PSSR, okay? And with that mode, using PSSR, it can run at a lower input resolution than native 4K, save more GPU time, like I said, and push the frame rate even higher. So now you are able to, again, exclusive to the Pro, you can't do this on the base, unlock the frame rate and get around 80 FPS on average. Okay, so you're getting, and believe it or not, even with the lower resolution and it's not native 4K, compared to native 4K, the Pro mode with PSSR actually looks better. It has better image quality. It looks more stable, more temporally stable, and it just looks sharper and cleaner while being able to push the frame rate to 80 FPS. So that, my friends, is a PS5 Pro difference as well. You can see here they're showing a close-up of the Pro Max in native 4K versus the PSSR version. And if you look at it, it looks like, that, like, for example, this hair doesn't look nearly as noisy. That's the PSSR upscaler in action. And if you were to look at this in motion, this is obviously a zoomed in view, but if you look at it in motion, it just amounts to a slightly smoother, cleaner looking image. Believe it or not, over native 4K. You can see that in motion there. Now, you can see also, before we get to that, the frame rate of the Pro Max mode. So both of these are running at native 4K, but again, you're only getting 30 FPS on the PS5. You're getting over 50 FPS on the Pro, right? And that's native 4K. That looks pretty darn good. So if you have a VRR display or monitor, 50, you're in VRR range on PS5, it's going to feel really smooth. It's going to feel pretty much like 60 FPS. So that's pretty cool. But let's go ahead a little bit more. Yeah, so now we see what I mean. So on the left is the Pro mode using PSSR versus the Pro Max mode, and we see it's a big difference in frame rate, right? So this is a cutscene, so that's why I dropped back down. But you saw it was running close to 80, in the 70s, well above 60, whereas the Pro Max mode is running in the 40s. You see there now it's in 80 in gameplay, right? And with a sharper resolve to 4K than the native 4K version on the right. That is a PS5 Pro difference. Okay. Now, another great example, I think, of a quality Pro integration that doesn't get talked about as much is Call of Duty Black Ops 6. All right. And they went to town. Eurogamer did a really good article detailing it. But they improved both modes. They added PSSR. There's no ray tracing in the game. But they did some pretty good improvements. So on the one hand, as you can see here, the 120 hertz mode now runs much closer to 120 hertz. It's still not locked, but on the base PS5, you were looking at something closer to 80 to 100 on average in the 120 hertz mode with lower settings than the 60 hertz mode, right? Equivalent. What they did with the Pro, first of all, is the 120 hertz mode on the Pro basically runs at the 60 hertz quality settings, right? So again, it's kind of like quality mode now being pushed to the performance mode at 120. Okay, so you get higher fidelity and a much closer, higher frame rate, right, than you got on the base in the 120 mode, right? And that's what we can see here. And then on top of that, the 60 hertz mode on the Pro is improved. They've added higher graphical settings, pushing things like the reflection quality, the global illumination quality, the ambient occlusion quality, etc. A lot of the lighting details are pushed even higher. And while still, hitting at least 60. But the other cool thing that they did is they unlocked, again, exclusive to the Pro, they have a VRR mode that unlocks the frame rate and can push beyond 60. And you typically wind up with something that is in the range of, 80 to 100, right? So 80 to 100 FPS in the quality mode with higher settings than what was in the base quality mode, right? Again, here's an example of the campaign running with that unlocked VRR. So again, there's higher graphical settings here. It does look sharper. It's using PSSR. It does look sharper than the base PS5, but look at the frame rate. This is the campaign, right? And this is the 60 hertz mode, right? Unlocked on the PS5 Pro. This is exclusive to the Pro. The base is locked at 60. You cannot get this. And there are a lot of downtimes to the game. You see the frame rate is above 100. It's even hitting 120 at times, right? I mean, it's amazing. It feels super smooth. It looks, again, very sharp, better than the base. Even in heavy action, you're looking at, 70s, 80s, 90s is common, right? So this is a quality example, in my opinion, of what a PS5 Pro upgrade could be in the best case scenario. All right, now here's the big one, guys, that I had to get into this. Arguably, the quintessential PS5 Pro, update is Assassin's Creed Shadows. And, there's a reason for that. This is one of the few games that really outlines all three of those pillars for the PS5 Pro. Advanced ray tracing, bigger GPU, PSSR. All right, they've implemented PSSR across the board. It's arguably the best PSSR implementation we've seen yet because it's using the latest version that fixes all the noise issues that we saw for some of the earlier games with ray tracing, with RTGI and RTAO. It looks super clean and super pristine in motion. And it really looks pretty darn close to a native 4K. I mean, it's a convincing 4K image if you're watching it on a 4K display. So PSSR is doing its thing. And we already showed, I showed you and we talked a little bit about that RTGI being in the performance mode. So again, in every mode, there's an extension of ray tracing that you don't see on the base PS5. The performance mode has the RTGI that's missing in the base PS5. The balance mode has now an extended ray trace reflection or ray trace specular detail, ray trace reflections that you can see in the puddles and water and all that kind of good stuff. And the 40 hertz balance mode that's missing on the base PS5. And similarly, in the quality mode, it has that same extended specular ray trace reflection effect, but even higher quality than what's in the balance mode. So all three have extended ray tracing effects that you don't see on the base. You get ray tracing, full ray tracing at 60 hertz, which matches what the base PS5 is doing in its quality mode. So again, the PS5 Pro Dream, the quality, quality fidelity, at 60 FPS performance, right? Or 60 FPS or higher performance, okay? So we're getting that. And they're using, again, the advanced GPU is pushing higher resolution. PSSR, like I said, one of the best implementations. Everything is clear. Detail is great. And then extended ray tracing. That's the PS5 Pro Dream. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the more recent and I would consider poor, lazy implementations or updates for PS5 Pro. And this is my fear, right? because we're starting to see that a lot more. And my fear is that this is going to become, relegated to what the PS4 Pro was, right? Which is to say the laziest thing. Pop it on the Pro. You're going to get a boost from just the raw GPU power that's there. But if you don't optimize for it and if you don't take advantage of the other two pieces, it's going to be fairly minimal. And we're seeing that from, there was a number of games that released in April that were pretty big releases that I was looking forward to. Some of them from Microsoft Xbox games coming. So Forza Horizon 5, which is what we're looking at now. Indiana Jones, we're going to take a look at as well. And even from Sony. So Returnal, one of my favorite games of all time and definitely one of my top 3 favorite games on the PS5, got a surprise Pro update, which is something I had been dreaming of. But it kind of soured because all it is a resolution bump. Again, that's nice. It's noticeable, but not terribly interesting. And we'll talk about what I feel they could have done to better take advantage of it. Now, here's Forza Horizon 5 first, right? One of the best looking Xbox games. And we can see it side by side. You're getting some frame dips. You also can see the dynamic resolution is dropping a bit on the PS5. The Series X is generally pretty stable, but we'll see. There's some drops in there. I'm not sure if it's going to show it in this particular clip. But in general, the PS5 Pro is just rock steady. 60 FPS and pretty much a locked native 4K. So effectively, you're getting a locked native 4K 60 on the PS5 Pro. That's nice. But now there are some quality improvements here. There's a little bit thicker. If we were to actually look at it side by side, you can see that there are some scenes where there's thicker foliage, like the foliage and vegetation settings are a little bit higher on the PS5 Pro. But again, in a racing game like this, moving at this clip, you're not going to notice that as much. So they're just basically, you're just getting the raw GPU increase, and it's just locking at 4K 60, which, as you can also see here, the Series X is also pretty much a locked 4K 60 in its performance mode. Again, the only difference is that the Pro does have slightly higher vegetation settings, so the foliage looks a little bit fuller. Again, hard to notice while you're racing, like you see, but it is there. But yeah, even when you saw some drops on the other systems, the PS5 Pro didn't really drop. All right, so here's Indiana Jones. Great game. I still haven't really gone through it, but I plan on it for sure. And, you can see immediately what's the real difference here. The PS5 can now hit native 4K, right? You can see the resolution. It is locking there at times. It still is dynamic. As you see, it does drop, but it generally is clearly above the resolution of the base PS5 especially, but even the Xbox Series X over there. So we're generally getting 4K 60 in this game, and the game features ray tracing as a core feature, ray tracing RTGI at least. Of course, the PC version has a ton of things they push beyond that. They have a full path trace lighting mode. They have RT reflections and a whole bunch of other stuff. We're not seeing any of that here on the Pro, though, right? The Pro, there are no higher settings, right? There's no higher frame rate, really, because 60 FPS is pretty much standard on the Series X and PS5. You see that there are instances where they do drop, right? The FPS does drop across the other two base consoles, and the PS5 Pro stayed locked at 60, right? So, yes, there's a little bit more stability with the frame rate. And again, you see that compared to the base PS5 especially, the resolution is noticeably higher, right? It does drop as it's doing now, but it still is way higher than what the base PS5 is, right, on average. So that's nice. I mean, there is something, but when you're playing this game, are you really going to notice that? If you're playing on a VR screen like I am, the drops are not going to really be perceptible to you. So that's not a huge deal. Again, if we got an unlocked frame rate, can push above 60, that would be nice. That would be a good idea. But more importantly, for a game like this, there's so much going on in the PC version and a lot of ray tracing effects. No, I don't expect path tracing on the PS5 Pro. But maybe they could have pushed for RT reflections in here. Maybe they could have added, a higher quality RTGI, because the RTGI that's in the console, the base consoles, are lower than the lowest setting on PC, right? So there clearly is scalability there that maybe they could have went up the ladder a bit. But as far as we can tell, this is a nothing burger, right? Effectively, it's just a resolution bump from the raw GPU horsepower that you can get. Again, on average is much higher, but in general, it's probably not going to be much more than what you see on the Series X for sure, which already has a higher resolution than what the PS5 can deliver. Now, I hate to do it, but I kind of have to. One of, again, my favorite games of all time, Returnal. I am happy that, they spent some time to do a PS5 Pro patch here. Considering how late it came, this is April, and the Pro had been out for 6 months, it's really kind of, uninteresting. They didn't really add anything to the game. All it is a pixel bump. They advertised it as being up to 2.5 times more pixels compared to the base PS5, right? So as we can see here on the base PS5, the native, that's what this NAT is. The native resolution is 1920 by 1080p. That's 1080p, right? They have a kind of complex way of kind of getting back to a 4K image, but the native internal resolution is just 1080p. The output resolution, as you see here, is 1620, and then they have to upscale to 4K. So there's a lot going on there. And ultimately, the image quality was the weak point on the base PS5. On the Pro, as you see here, now we have a dynamic resolution, first of all. The other resolution was fixed, as you saw. It was 1080p locked. And yeah, we're pushing 1728. So going from 1080p to 1728p is, in fact, well over 2 times the number of pixels, or over 2 times the resolution for sure. We're getting something much closer to a native 4K, and the output now, as you see, is 4K. So this is this is a way more than that 48% render performance figure. This is way more than even, the raw 67% larger GPU, right? This is legitimately pushing over 2 times the number of pixels, 2.5 times, even approaching 3 times in some cases. So that's meaningful. But again, when you're playing the game, and I'm playing it now again, and it's noticeable if you have a nice, big, sharp 4K screen, but it's hardly game-changing, right? Remember, I would have much preferred them actually push, for example, a 120 hertz mode. That, for a game like this that moves that fast, that would be meaningful. But also, it would have been great to see them implement the PC's ray tracing. So the PC version added RT reflections, which again, in this game, which has a lot of wetness, it adds a lot, as you can see here. Most of the time, I would say that, RT reflection may not add a whole lot, but in this case, it adds meaningful things there. It completely changes the look of certain scenes. Look at that, right? Man, why couldn't they add that, right? You would think they had enough horsepower. I think the reason comes down to not technical, but just a time and resource thing. Housemarque is the studio. They're not a big studio, and they're already working on, their follow-up to this game. They've already shown it. It looks like it could be pretty cool. I'm looking forward to it. So they're all hands on deck for that. They went back and, I guess they tried to see what can they do with a reasonable amount of time and resources, not putting a whole lot to it, I'm sure. And this is what they got, right? I think the ray tracing would have probably been a bit more work on the console side to get that working properly. It's not like they can just take the PC code and plop it on a PlayStation, right? But man, look at the difference it makes. This would have been meaningful. And I think it's possible, again, given that extra ray tracing performance, right, that the PS5 Pro has. So they didn't do that. They didn't give us a unlocked frame rate. So we're still pretty much playing the same game at the same frame rate, just with a slightly sharper image. Again, I just feel like there could have been a lot more there. As my final game, all right, I know this video has been kind of going on, but I think this is pretty cool, interesting stuff. But as my final game, I just want to highlight Doom, which is this actually is not even technically out yet. It's coming out this week. But the early access, I think, is out. So, man, we're talking about one of the biggest releases of the year. We're talking about id Tech being among always the top state-of-the-art engine that you will find in gaming, and one of the top studios you will find in gaming. And they clearly spent almost no time on optimizing for the Pro. The big three is largely absent. And again, all we get here is just the raw pixel bump from the larger GPU. That's about as uninteresting and boring as you can get for a Pro update. There's no PSSR present at all. This game, again, has ray tracing as a core feature. There is no turning off ray tracing. The game uses, even on the consoles and the Series S, it has a baseline of RTGI in it. Now the PC adds ray trace reflections and soon a path tracing mode, and it goes out the wazoo with the ray tracing. I'm not expecting all of that for the PS5 Pro, but ray trace reflections should be doable. Again, the horsepower is there. The improvement is there. Again, with PSSR, reduce the resolution, the input resolution, get some more GPU time, take advantage of that 3x RT performance in the Pro, and you can't tell me that you can't get at least some level of RT reflections on the Pro version, right? Running at 60. Not the full path tracing, but come on now, right? So give us that. Again, it's Doom. It's a first-person shooter. It's super fast, right? A 120 hertz mode would be awesome here, right? There's no performance modes, right, in this game. There's just a single mode that runs at 60. And that's cool in a way. I like that. But there could have been an opportunity, I think, to have a 120 hertz mode that, again, is using VRR and pushes. It's not going to be a lot to 120, mind you, but it's pushing something closer to 120 to get us in the 80, 90, or 100-ish range on the Pro, at least. That would be awesome. RCGI is still present. All the greatest game, looks amazing. The technology is amazing when you really break it down. But as you can see here in the side-by-side, all we're really getting is a difference in pixel counts. And yes, it is a meaningful difference in pixel counts. At any point, if I pause, the screen, it's always several hundred pixels ahead on the y-axis, right? Well above the 50%, right? That should be for the rendering performance figure that Sony quoted, right? In many cases, this is pushing almost double, right? I mean, this is running at less than 1080p on the base and really, really close to 1440p on the Pro. And we already know that 1440p is over 2x 1080p, right? So this is clearly pushing like almost twice the number of pixels. Again, like Returnal is a meaningful bump, but again, in the context of gameplay at these resolutions, it's not going to be terribly noticeable. Yes, playing it on a big screen side by side, you will see a difference, but that's it. There's no higher graphical settings. There's no RT reflections or again other RT effects here, like I mentioned, and we're still playing it at the same frame rate, right, that existed on the base. So again, it's just a matter of effort, right? It takes a little bit of time to implement PSSR. PSSR does have a performance cost. It does have some overhead, so you got to be mindful of that. You got to, there's some optimization work, in enabling that. And if they wanted to add RT, that can be a pretty big effort. And don't get me wrong, I would not be surprised. I'm not going to say this because I haven't heard this directly from the devs, but I would not be surprised if they are working on a few, future Pro improvements and enhancements to come. Some people think that it's a conspiracy because they're technically a Microsoft studio and Xbox studio, so they're not going to do that to make the Pro shine, right? Blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's that, right? They have free reign to do what they want to do with the Pro. I just think that I know that they have been really crunching to just get this game out and get it polished. There's a lot, like I said, that they're working on with the PC version. And I just think that they haven't gotten, the priority was just to get it out. There may be a Pro update, I think, to this one coming. And, there are some things that they can do. Like I said, they can try to add some additional RT effects and use that performance for that. They may be able to push a higher frame rate mode, which would be awesome. Either one of those, I think, would be, somewhat game-changing relative to the base PS5. So it makes it a meaningful input. But as it stands, as you can see here, there is a sizable boost in general to the resolution. So, all right, guys. So let's recap, okay? The big three, PS5 Pro, larger GPU, roughly 67-70% larger in terms of raw compute power. That's going to give you a lot of just boosts with very little effort You throw your game on the PS5 Pro relative to the base, and you could expect to see roughly 40 to 50%, more rendering performance right off the bat. That's what Sony advertises. That's pretty much there. That's the safest thing a dev can do, right? The second is advanced ray tracing, which again, I've heard devs actually confirm that they're seeing real world performance that's 3 times faster for ray tracing calculations on the Pro relative to the base. That is sizable. That's a meaningful improvement. Okay. There are some games that take great advantage of that and enable ray tracing effects that you just could not do on the base. I've shown Alan Wake 2 being a good example of that. Formula One racing, GT7, I didn't show that, but GT7 now adds ray tracing in the gameplay that you couldn't do on the base. That's where that's coming from, right? Those type of games. And Assassin's Creed Shadows was a recent example that I highlighted as well, okay? Then the third is and arguably the kind of biggest differentiator is the PSSR, all right? PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, AI-driven upscaler to reconstruct a 4K image intelligently. Better than the FSR or TAA solutions that will be available on the base PS5. There are several games where just the PSSR makes a really clear night and day difference with no ray tracing. I showed Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Space Marine 2 as being good examples of that. There are a handful. But by and large, is there a big difference with the PS5 Pro over the base PS5? And again, I still would say that to most people, the answer is no. In terms of what you will see, okay? The biggest differences are going to come from those cases where ray tracing effects are added where they didn't exist before, like the games I showed. Those are going to be your biggest just ABs if you can look at them side by side. Most games, unfortunately, though, as I showed and talked about at the end, we're seeing that a lot more. Forza, Indiana Jones, Returnal, Days Gone Remastered, which also just came out. I think they're still working on an update for the Pro for that one, but as we see it now, it does have PSSR, but ultimately that's it. It kind of looks the same. It doesn't look that much different with PSSR. Frame rates are generally the same as what we see on the base PS5. So not a great update there either, but like I said, they might be working on a further update. We shall see. But there's a lot of games coming out where it's just, here, you got a bigger GPU, plop it on, you're going to get higher resolution, higher pixel counts. And as I talked about the PS4 Pro, that is to me one of the worst things you can do with these mid-gen console refreshes, right, or upgraded consoles. It's boring, right, and it's not very noticeable. You're not going to see a whole lot of difference between 1080p and 1440p or 1440p and 1800p, or it's not going to make a big difference. But that's what we're seeing in a lot of cases, right? And another key takeaway: there are a lot of games, and I've shown some examples already. You've seen it, that go well beyond the 50% roughly rendering performance advantage that Sony advertises for the Pro. There are games where we're seeing clearly 2x or over 2x the rendering performance, over 2x resolution, doubling up the frame rates or almost doubling the frame rates while increasing graphical settings, etc., etc. The PS5 Pro is a powerful console. It is the world's most powerful console in existence today. And some of the games that really take advantage of it, games like Assassin's Creed Shadows, I'm going to go back to that because that's one of the quintessential ones. Games like Stellar Blade, games like, in my opinion, Black Ops 6, the work that they did there, we can see that. All relative to the base PS5, we can see well beyond, 50%, more performance, right? 50% more better rendering. And even in the boring games, right? I've shown that. Technically speaking, Indiana Jones is often doing more than 50% pixels relative to the base PS5. Doom Dark Ages, right, is clearly pushing oftentimes almost 2x the pixels on the Pro relative to the base PS5, right? Almost. It's usually in the 60 to 80-ish % range, right? But that's still meaningful and definitely more than the 50% that Sony had advertised. So we clearly are seeing that. It obviously depends on the game, the engine, where the bottlenecks are, how much optimization is done, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, Returnal was pushing 2.5 times, going from 1080p up to almost 1800p. That's a huge difference, right? So there's a lot of potential there. It's just a matter of developers taking the time. And that's usually where Sony's first party will come in. And that's a problem this gen. We haven't seen a lot from Sony first party in terms of actual, real, built from the ground up exclusive PS5 games. We've almost seen none of that, to be quite honest. Tons and tons of remasters and remakes and whatever. Or cross-gen titles like Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok and GT7. These are all cross-gen games. They look better on the PS5, of course, but they're cross-gen. So, and of course, the big elephant in the room. What does this all mean for GTA 6? That could be a whole nother video in itself. But PS5 Pro is almost certainly going to be the best place to play GTA 6. And now that is delayed again to, now almost a year from now, Rockstar should maybe have more time to put towards optimizing for the PS5 Pro, getting PSSR in there. Again, GTA 6 is another game built from the core with ray tracing. There is no disabling ray tracing in that game. You got to take advantage of that additional ray tracing performance in that PS5 Pro console. You got to. Give us additional ray tracing effects that are closer to the PC, but not, above and beyond what's on the base PS5, for example, right? Give us some additional ray tracing, push some more performance. Will we see a 60 FPS mode? I think we will, even on the base, to be honest. But maybe there's something beyond what the base can deliver. Maybe the base goes up to 40 in a balance mode, let's say, and then we can actually get it in a 60 FPS mode on the PS5 Pro as an exclusive feature. I'm not saying they're going to push a 120 Hz mode, of course, but whatever it is, if it's locked to 30 on the base, maybe we can get a 40 FPS mode on the Pro, right? We shall see. Hopefully that makes sense, guys. Look out for games that are doing something new or pushing beyond with ray tracing, and look out for games that actually are delivering more frames on the PS5 Pro, which requires usually VRR support, unlock frame rate to really see how far that PS5 Pro can push. I've given you some examples. Hopefully that is meaningful to you guys and you learned a lot from this video. So you tell me now, does the PS5 Pro look different, make a difference when you look at it in totality? Some of the games that I highlighted, have you played them? What do you think? And other games that I didn't talk about. Tell me what some of your favorite PS5 Pro updates have been. Meantime, till the next time, I got more content coming, like I said. Really appreciate you for getting to the end of this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you enjoy more that is to come. True Techno Gamer, signing off.